A wounded Navy SEAL lay beneath a fallen pine in the late Wisconsin snow, his coat carrying a strange scent no forest should know. Around him, wolf tracks circled like a warning written in white. Then Clara Voss and her German Shepherd K9 found his broken whisper. Don't let them close the bridge. If you believe God still guides the forgotten home, leave amen. Pine Glass Ridge woke beneath a late spring snow, the kind that didn't fall with anger, but with memory. The northern Wisconsin town sat near the cold blue shoulder of Lake Superior, tucked between dark pine forests, frozen marshland, and a highway that cut through the wilderness like a silver scar. Morning light spread over the half-frozen lake in soft gold, touching the roofs of small wooden houses where chimney smoke rose in gentle columns. From a distance, everything looked clean, almost blessed. But Clara Voss had learned long ago that beauty could cover a wound better than darkness ever could. Clara was 30 years old, a federal agent with the kind of calm face that made people lower their voices before they knew why. She was tall and lean, with dark brown hair pinned into a low knot beneath her navy winter cap, pale skin touched by wind, and gray-blue eyes that seemed to study not just what stood in front of her, but what had been removed from the scene. She wore a dark FBI field jacket over thermal layers, black tactical pants, winter boots, and gloves worn soft at the palms from years of work. Clara did not enjoy power. She trusted patience more than pressure, silence more than speeches, and evidence more than easy fear. Pine Glass Ridge had not brought her here because of wolves. It had brought her here because a federally funded wildlife crossing called North Star Passage was beginning to smell of fraud, altered environmental reports, missing materials, and witnesses who suddenly stopped answering their phones. Beside her in the government SUV sat Ranger, her 5-year-old German Shepherd, K9. He was large and powerful, with a sable coat marked by a dark saddle and golden-brown highlights along his chest and shoulders. His ears stood sharp as carved black leaves, and his amber eyes held the grave attention of an animal who had seen too much human confusion and still chosen to work beside it. Ranger could locate biological traces, hidden devices, chemical lures, and missing people. But Clara sometimes believed his deeper gift was older than training. He noticed when the world was lying. They were supposed to meet Sheriff Owen Pike at the Ranger office by 8. But as Clara guided the SUV along the North Access Road, Ranger suddenly sat upright. He did not bark. He did not paw the window. He simply turned his muzzle toward the tree line, nostrils widening, body going still in a way that made Clara's hands slow on the wheel. The highway hummed somewhere beyond the pines, a constant river of tires over wet pavement. On the shoulder ahead, a green construction marker leaned under snow. Bridge marker 17. Clara pulled over. The cold met her as soon as she opened the door. It smelled of pine resin, thawing ice, and something faintly sour beneath the clean morning air. Ranger stepped down first, nose low, moving with careful purpose. Clara clipped the lead to his harness and followed him past the guardrail into the trees. Snow lay thin over the ground, bright where the sun touched it, blue in the shadows. At first, she saw only paw prints, many of them, looping and crossing near the edge of the woods. Wolf tracks, not one animal, several. But the pattern was wrong, too tight, too restless. Not a clean trail, not a hunt. More like a circle drawn by panic. Then she saw the human print. A military-style boot had pressed deep into the melting snow, heel dragged sideways as if the person had lost balance. A few feet beyond it, another mark gouged the crusted surface. Then a long, shallow trail led toward a fallen pine. Clara crouched, one gloved hand hovering above the snow without touching it. "Easy," she whispered. Ranger's ears tilted forward. His body stiffened. A sound rose from behind the fallen pine. Not a cry, not even a word, only a thin scrape of breath against the cold. For one suspended second, the whole forest seemed to stop listening to the highway and turn toward that fragile sound. Clara moved faster now, but not carelessly. She rounded the fallen tree and found a man half sheltered beneath its branches. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and built with the hard lines of a man shaped by discipline rather than comfort. His dark hair was cut short, his jaw shadowed by several days of stubble, and his face had the pale, weathered look of someone who had spent the night bargaining with the cold and refusing to lose. His gray jacket was torn at one sleeve. His phone lay cracked near his hand. One leg was bent awkwardly beneath him, and his breathing came shallow and uneven. Clara knelt beside him. "Federal Agent Clara Voss," she said, low and steady. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyelids moved. His eyes opened a fraction, gray and unfocused at first, then sharpening when he saw Ranger. "Not the wolves," he breathed. Clara glanced at the tracks around them. She could see where the animals had approached, circled, retreated, and returned. The marks were close, but not like a feeding pattern, more like warning, confusion, pressure. Something had drawn them here, something unnatural. Ranger moved toward the man's backpack, which lay partly buried under snow. The dog's nose worked once, twice, then he pulled back with a low, troubled sound. Clara recognized that reaction. Chemical lure. Not strong now, but present enough to stain the air. The man gripped her sleeve with surprising strength. "North Star," he whispered. "Don't let them close the bridge." "Who are you?" Clara asked. "Ethan Rourke." The name touched something in her memory. Daniel Rourke had been one of the environmental engineers listed in the North Star Passage files. Daniel had passed away 6 months earlier in what local records called a winter road accident. Clara had read the report on the flight in. Too neat, too final, too clean around the edges. She opened Ethan's backpack carefully. Inside, she found a folded map of the North Star Passage corridor, a small biological sample tube, an old photograph of 2 brothers standing beside a half-built wildlife fence, and a cracked USB drive wrapped in a piece of cloth. Ranger leaned close to the bag again, then turned his head toward the slope above them. Clara followed his gaze. On the snowy ridge, a silver-gray wolf stood between 2 pines. It was lean, watchful, and still as a carved spirit of the forest. Its coat caught the morning light, pale along the shoulders, dark around the face. W-17, Clara thought, though she had not yet seen the animal's file in person. The tagged female wolf Lena Hart had reported near the project corridor. The wolf did not advance. It did not bare its teeth. It only watched the humans below, tense and uncertain, as if the same false scent that had brought the pack toward Ethan still hung between them like a bad command. Clara raised one hand slowly, signaling the rescue team over the radio to approach without sirens, without shouting, without bright lights. "No noise," she said. "Keep distance from the ridge. We have a live wildlife presence." Ethan's eyes fluttered. "Daniel knew," he whispered. Clara looked down at him. Knew what? But Ethan's strength faded before the answer came. Ranger stepped closer to him, not touching, only standing guard with his body angled between the wounded man and the forest. For all his training, the dog looked almost ancient in that moment, like some loyal creature from an old winter legend, placed there to keep one soul from crossing too soon into the snow. Minutes later, the rescue crew arrived. Ethan was lifted carefully onto a stretcher and carried toward the road. Ranger stayed alert, tracking every movement in the trees. The silver wolf remained on the ridge a little longer, then turned and slipped back into the pines. No drama, no charge. Only a vanishing gray shape, leaving behind the uneasy feeling that the forest had come close to speaking, and then chosen silence. When the ambulance pulled away, Clara stood beside Ranger at the edge of the construction corridor. In her left hand lay the biological sample tube. In her right, the cracked USB drive. At her feet, wolf tracks crossed human boot prints in the thawing snow. Ahead, North Star Passage rose unfinished beyond the trees, its temporary fences bent under ice, its promise half-built and already wounded. Clara looked at the highway beyond the pines, where cars moved endlessly beneath the cold morning sun. This case had not begun with wolves. It had begun with a path closed in the wrong place, a lie buried under snow, and a man left carrying a scent no honest forest would have put on him. Ethan Rourke was taken to the small medical clinic on the east side of Pineglass Ridge, a low brick building with frost still clinging to the window corners and a flag snapping gently in the pale morning wind. The town had only one main road, one diner, one church bell that rang too early, and one clinic where people brought everything from broken wrists to frostbitten hands. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic, old coffee, and wet wool. Ethan lay in an exam room under clean white lights, his broad shoulders too large for the narrow bed, his face gray with exhaustion, but still carrying the stubborn angles of a man who had been trained to endure more than any body should be asked to endure. His dark hair was flattened with melted snow, his jaw rough with stubble, and even half-conscious, his right hand kept twitching toward where a weapon would have been if the world had still been simple enough to divide into enemies and allies. Clara Voss stood outside the room with Ranger at her side. The German shepherd sat close to her left leg, his sable coat still damp from the forest, his amber eyes fixed on Ethan's backpack as if the thing might breathe. Clara had already notified the federal task force, secured the cracked USB drive, and sealed the small biological sample tube in an evidence pouch. Yet the room felt less like the start of a clean investigation and more like the opening of a door that had been nailed shut from the other side. She watched the paramedic finish wrapping Ethan's injured leg, careful and quiet, while the clinic nurse adjusted the blanket over him. Ethan had survived the cold, the fall, and the circle of wolves, but Clara knew survival was not the same as safety. Sometimes it only meant a person had been carried far enough to tell the truth. A woman arrived just after 9, bringing the smell of pine smoke and outdoor weather with her. Lena Hart stepped into the hallway, carrying a canvas field bag, a stack of folders, and the kind of silence that belonged to people who spent more time listening to animals than explaining themselves to committees. She was about 50, tall in a spare, weathered way, with silver-brown hair tied at the nape of her neck and a face lined by sun, wind, and long patience. Her eyes were green, sharp, and tired, not unkind, but difficult to fool. She wore a faded brown field jacket, wool gloves tucked into one pocket, and mud-stained boots that looked as if they had walked through every season Pineglass Ridge had ever survived. Lena was not Ethan's doctor. She was a field biologist and wildlife rehabilitator who had once worked with the state wolf study that tracked W-17. Clara had asked for her because this case had stopped being only human the moment Ranger found that scent on Ethan's coat. "You found him near Marker 17?" Lena asked. Clara nodded. "With wolf tracks around him, but the pattern was wrong." Lena looked down at Ranger. "He knows that, too." Ranger's ears shifted, as if he understood he had been named as a witness. Clara almost smiled, but the feeling did not reach her face. She led Lena into a side room where Ethan's belongings had been laid out on a clean table. Backpack, torn jacket, cracked phone, folded map, sample tube, photograph, USB, and the small broken piece of metal shaped like a pine leaf. Lena did not touch anything at first. She only looked. People who worked in the wild learned that touching too early could ruin the story a place was trying to tell. A faint metallic chime slipped from the table when Ranger's nose nudged the broken pine leaf fragment. The sound was small, almost tender, yet it froze Ethan in the next room awake. For one breath, no one spoke. The little note hung in the clinic air like a memory that had finally found its way home. Ethan turned his head toward the hallway. "Daniel," he whispered. Clara stepped into the exam room. Ethan's eyes were clearer now, though pain still lived behind them like a storm behind a closed door. "Daniel Rourke was your brother," Clara said. Ethan gave one slow nod. "He built wind chimes from scrap metal, said a bridge shouldn't be silent if it was asking the forest to trust it." His voice was rough, but there was warmth under the roughness, the kind grief cannot destroy because it was made before grief arrived. Clara pulled a chair closer, but did not sit. Ethan seemed like a man who would answer better if no one tried to soften him too much. "Daniel worked on North Star Passage," Clara said. "He believed in it," Ethan replied. "More than I did. I thought it was another public project with a pretty name and too many speeches. Daniel said it was different, said if people were going to build roads through old animal paths, the least we could do was leave a door open." Ethan swallowed, his eyes moving toward Ranger. 6 months ago they said he drove off an icy road. Simple accident, bad weather, no one's fault. You didn't believe that? No. Ethan's fingers tightened on the blanket. Daniel sent me a message 2 nights before he passed. He said, "If wild animals start entering town, don't blame them first. Look for who closed the wrong door of the forest." Then nothing. Clara let the sentence settle. Outside the window, the morning sun had begun to loosen snow from the clinic roof. Drops fell in a slow rhythm, soft as a clock counting down. Ethan told her he had come to Pineglass Ridge under his own name, but without telling many people why. He had rented a room at Pineglass Motor Lodge, a roadside place with old blue doors and a sign that blinked even in daylight. The owner, Marla Finch, had watched him more closely than he realized. Marla was 58, broad-shouldered, with red hair gone silver at the temples, fair skin marked by old freckles, and a voice that made foolish men reconsider their sentences halfway through. She had lost her husband years earlier in a logging accident, and since then she had developed a hard kindness, the sort that did not ask many questions, but noticed every answer people tried not to give. When Graham Vale came asking where Ethan had gone, Marla had refused to help him. "He paid for a room," she had said, "not for me to sell his shadow." When Clara later visited the motel, Marla handed over the security footage without drama. The video was grainy, blue with night, but clear enough. Ethan's rented truck left the lot near dusk. A black pickup followed 3 minutes later. Clara watched the footage twice. Graham Vale had not yet entered the story in person, but his outline was already there. Careful, polished, patient. Back at the clinic, Lena spread W-17's old tracking reports beside Daniel's map. W-17 had been tagged in a state study before North Star Passage began. For months her movements made sense. Forest corridor, meltwater line, ridge trail, deep pine cover. Then, 3 weeks ago, the signals started appearing near homes, roadside bins, and construction access points. Too often, too cleanly. Yet the trail cameras did not always show the wolf where the collar said she should be. "Someone may have removed the collar," Lena said quietly. "Placed it where they wanted fear to appear." Ranger lowered his head to Ethan's jacket again, then turned toward the north-facing window. The same scent lived on the fabric, the field tie, the backpack strap, and the chime fragment, lure chemical, construction mud, and a cold mineral smell Lena recognized from the old salt storage shed near the worksite. Clara pinned 3 points on the map: Bridge Marker 17, Pineglass Motor Lodge, and the salt shed behind the construction yard. The line between them cut straight toward North Star Passage. Ethan watched from the doorway, leaning on the nurse's support, jaw tight with more than pain. "Daniel left something there," he said. Clara looked at the cracked USB in its evidence sleeve, then at Ranger, whose muzzle now rested beside the broken wind chime. Outside, the snow was melting under a brighter sun, but the cold had not surrendered yet. Ethan had not simply been found in the forest, he had been placed there, and the wolves, wild and frightened, and blamed by everyone, had been turned into a weapon by human hands. Lena Hart's Wildlife Rescue Center sat where Pineglass Ridge stopped pretending to be a town and began admitting it belonged to the forest. The building was an old timber lodge with a patched green roof, wire enclosures behind it, and wind chimes made from antlers and scrap metal hanging along the porch. Beyond the fence, dark pines leaned toward the snow like old witnesses. A red-tailed hawk with one damaged wing watched from a covered perch. 2 young deer stood inside a recovery pen, their thin legs trembling whenever a truck passed on the distant highway. The place smelled of straw, pine shavings, animal feed, and the clean, sharp cold that followed Lena Hart everywhere. Clara Voss stepped out of the SUV with Ranger at her side. The German shepherd moved quietly, his sable coat catching the morning sun in gold-brown flashes, his black saddle dark against the snow. He did not pull toward the animals. He knew the difference between work and curiosity. His ears shifted at every wing beat, every rustle of straw, every distant engine from the highway. Clara watched him for a moment and felt that old trust settle inside her. In places where people bent the truth, Ranger often found the straightest path. Lena led Clara into a small data room behind the main office. The room was crowded with maps, field notebooks, trail camera images, sample envelopes, and a wall calendar marked with wolf movements in blue ink. Lena's hands were rough from years of wire, weather, and frightened creatures. She did not decorate her words. She placed a folder on the table and opened it to a photograph of W-17, the silver-gray female wolf Clara had seen on the ridge. She used to stay north of the meltwater line, Lena said. Deep cover, low contact, normal behavior. Then North Star expanded the work zone. The map beneath the photo showed a narrow natural route running along a seasonal stream. On the official project sheet, the same line had been renamed a drainage ditch. Clara looked closer. That changes its protection status. It makes it easier to ignore, Lena replied. Her voice stayed calm, but Clara heard the burn underneath. Every spring, thaw water opens that corridor first. Deer use it. Foxes use it. Wolves follow it because their mothers followed it, and their mothers before them. You block it with rock, pipe, and temporary fence, and they don't hold a meeting to discuss alternatives. They go where the land still lets them go. Clara studied the dates. W-17's appearances near homes began 2 weeks after the corridor was blocked. A runner reported being followed in fog. Several residents heard wolves near the service road. 2 trail cameras showed a silver shape near the construction waste area. The pattern looked alarming at first glance, but too perfect at second glance. Fear made a loud witness. Evidence spoke softer. At noon, Clara and Ranger drove with Lena to a small house at the edge of town where Helen Morris lived alone. Helen was 64, narrow-shouldered and pale, with soft white hair pinned behind her ears and hands that never stopped folding a dish towel even after she sat down. Her living room was warm, filled with old photographs, crocheted blankets, and the careful quiet of a home where someone had once been loved loudly and was now missed in silence. On the mantel stood a framed picture of Helen's late husband in a fishing vest, one arm around a gray-muzzled old dog named Benny. "Benny was my husband's dog first," Helen said. Her voice was gentle, but grief had made it thin. After Frank passed, Benny kept the house from sounding empty. She looked toward the back door, where a clean bowl still sat on a mat. Then one morning he was gone. Graham Vale had visited Helen twice after Benny disappeared. He had told her North Star Passage was making wildlife bold. He had told her the town needed people brave enough to speak. Clara did not correct Helen's pain. Pain was not evidence, but it was real. She only asked where Benny had last been seen. Helen pointed toward the construction road and lowered her eyes, as if ashamed to hope and afraid to know. From Helen's home, Lena guided Clara to meet Earl Whitcomb, a retired mail carrier who still delivered part-time along the rural route. Earl was 68, short and broad through the chest, with a gray beard trimmed close, watery blue eyes, and a wool cap pulled low over his ears. He had the careful manner of a man who had spent 40 years walking up icy steps with letters in his hand and other people's weather in his bones. He admitted, after a long silence, that he had seen W-17 on the old Timber Bridge Road. "She stood right in front of my truck," he said. "Didn't come at me, didn't run either, just stood there." Later, he learned the bridge ahead had softened underneath the snow. He had told no one. "Folks already think old men see ghosts in daylight," he muttered. At that moment, from beyond Earl's shed, a single raven lifted from a pine branch with a harsh cry, and a strip of black feathers flashed across the white sky. Ranger turned so sharply the leash snapped tight. The sudden sound left a hollow pause behind it, as if the forest had struck a match and shown them, for 1 second, how close all hidden things were to the surface. Ranger pulled toward the construction waste area. Clara followed, Lena beside her, Earl watching from his porch with one hand pressed to the rail. Behind a row of temporary fencing, snow had been shoveled over black contractor bags. Ranger nosed one, then stepped back and looked at Clara. She cut it open carefully. Inside were scraps of spoiled meat, food waste, and cloth strips carrying the same bitter chemical scent found on Ethan's coat. Nearby, a trail camera had been twisted toward the ground. Tire tracks curved through the slush, wide and deep. Clara photographed them. The tread pattern matched the black pickup seen on Marla's motel camera. By late afternoon, Graham Vail arrived at the site as if he had been invited by the snow itself. He was in his early 40s, lean, well-groomed, with dark hair combed back, a smooth jaw, and a charcoal coat too clean for a work yard. His boots shone despite the mud. His smile had the warmth of a locked office. "Agent Voss," he said, offering a hand she did not take. "I hope we can keep this town from being swallowed by panic." "Panic seems useful to some people," Clara answered. Graham's smile thinned but did not break. He spoke of safety, jobs, taxpayers, elderly residents afraid to walk their roads. Every sentence sounded reasonable until Clara noticed each one ended at the same locked gate. Close North Star passage, suspend the funding, reconsider the land. When Graham left, Ranger found the abandoned storage shed behind the waste area. Inside, beneath a tarp stiff with frozen mud, Clara discovered a second map. Red marks circled every reported W-17 sighting. Some marks matched real trail camera locations. Others matched collar pings that Lena said had never lined up with visual proof. In the corner, written in black marker, were 4 words: "Close enough for fear." Clara stood very still. Outside, the afternoon sun shone on the unfinished wildlife bridge, making the steel glow almost holy. But inside the shed, the truth smelled of spoiled food, wet mud, and human planning. Graham did not need wolves to hurt anyone. He only needed a town to see a shadow near its porch and imagine the rest. Pineglass Ridge was not a cruel town. Clara Voss understood that by the 4th morning. Cruel towns had a different smell. Pineglass smelled of wood smoke, old coffee, wet wool, and neighborly habits worn thin by hard winters. People shoveled one another's porches without being asked. They left soup at doors when someone's truck did not move for 3 days. They knew who needed firewood, who needed silence, and who needed a hand on Sunday morning. But fear had a way of wearing the clothes of wisdom. It told good people to wait. It told them someone else would speak. It told them peace was worth more than truth until peace became only another name for surrender. Clara found Raymond Cole in a cabin beyond the last mail route where the pines grew close enough to scratch the roof when the wind turned. Raymond was 72, a former Marine with a heavy frame softened by age, but not defeated by it. His white hair was cut close, his beard was square and gray, and his face had the weathered angles of a man who had spent more years outside than inside. One shoulder sat slightly lower than the other from an old injury, and his hands were large, knuckled, and scarred from tools, rifles, and winter work. He greeted Clara from his porch without smiling. Ranger stood beside her, calm and watchful, his amber eyes moving from Raymond to the tree line. "I saw the truck," Raymond said before Clara finished introducing herself. His voice was low, rough, and tired of carrying its own weight. "Black pickup, 2 nights before your seal ended up in the snow, back near the old service cut and unloaded contractor bags." "Why didn't you report it?" Clara asked. Raymond looked beyond her, toward a narrow trail slipping between the pines. "Because 20 years ago I reported timbermen cutting past the boundary. Half this town called me a liar until the state proved me right. By then, nobody apologized. They just stopped waving." His jaw shifted once. "At my age, Agent Voss, a man doesn't fear losing his reputation. He fears losing the last quiet corner he has left." Clara did not soften the question. "And did silence keep it quiet?" Raymond's eyes moved to Ranger. The old Marine looked away first. The answer came when Ranger lowered his nose and pulled toward the trail behind the cabin. Raymond stiffened. "That path goes to my wife's spring walk," he said. "Used to, anyway." His wife, Clara learned, had been named Elise. She had passed away 4 years earlier, a school librarian with a laugh Raymond described as too young for any room she entered. Every April, when the snow began to open, she had walked to a little meltwater, run behind the ridge to watch the first fox tracks appear in the mud. Raymond had not gone there since she was laid to rest. Ranger led them through pines and thawing snow until the ground dipped. There, beneath a mess of broken stone, temporary pipe, and orange construction fencing, a thin stream struggled to move. Water pressed under ice, trapped and clouded, whispering against the blockage as if the land itself had been trying to speak through its teeth. Lena Hart arrived soon after, carrying field flags and a rolled project map beneath one arm. She knelt near the water with that grave stillness Clara had come to know. "This is not a drainage ditch," Lena said. "This is the meltwater corridor Daniel marked." Raymond removed his cap. Not for prayer exactly, more like respect. "Elise used to say the animals came here before we knew spring had arrived." Clara looked at the official report on her tablet. The same waterway had been downgraded, renamed, and stripped of protection. Daniel's old note was attached to the earlier file. "Not the wolves going wrong. Our map is wrong." Then the ice beneath the stone gave a sudden sharp crack, and a thread of water burst free, dark and shining in the pale sun. For one breath, everyone stopped. The sound was small, but it felt like the earth had answered them, not with anger, but with a wounded truth finally finding air. That afternoon, Clara met Noah Calder behind the equipment shed, where rusted plows and unused traffic barrels sat under a plastic tarp. Noah was 24, thin and tall, with sandy hair falling into his eyes and a face still young enough to look startled by its own guilt. His hands were red from cold, his jacket carried the logo of the North Star security contractor, and his mouth kept tightening before he spoke, as if each truth had to push past fear first. He cared for his mother, June, who had bad arthritis and depended on his insurance. Graham Vale had understood that. Men like Graham had a gift for finding the soft place in another person's life and pressing a thumb into it. "I opened the side gate," Noah admitted. "I turned 2 cameras off for 10 minutes, sometimes 20. He said it was to protect equipment deliveries. Said if anything went wrong, he could make it look like I left my post." "Did you move the bags?" Clara asked. Noah stared at the snow. "Some. I didn't know what was in them at first." Ranger stepped closer and sniffed the cuff of Noah's jacket. The dog did not growl. He simply looked at Clara. Noah saw that look and seemed to shrink inside his coat. "I backed up footage," he whispered. "On a private card. Not because I was brave, because I was scared he'd blame me. Fear can still hand over the truth, Clara said, but not if it waits too long. Before Noah could answer, Ranger's head snapped toward the far fence. A faint sound trembled through the cold. Not a howl, not a bark. A thin, panicked whine from somewhere beyond the temporary barrier. Lena heard it too. Her face changed at once. They found the wolf pup tangled where the wildlife guide fence narrowed into a badly angled construction panel. It was small, gray-brown, long-legged and terrified, caught by its hind leg in a loop of loose wire. Clara's first instinct was to move, but Lena raised a hand. 50 yards away, W-17 stood between the pines, silver coat bright against the shadows, eyes locked on them. No one spoke. Ranger lowered himself slowly into the snow. He did not approach the pup. He did not challenge the mother. He made himself small, steady, almost humble. Ethan Rourke, pale but upright with a brace on one leg, had come with Sheriff Owen's support team to observe the sight from a safe distance. Ethan did not try to be heroic. He simply guided the men back with one lifted hand. "Lower the lights," he said. "No sudden movement. Give Lena room." Lena moved like a woman disarming grief. With a soft rescue pole and a net, she eased the wire loose while Clara held the fence panel steady. The pup trembled, then scrambled free toward W-17. The silver wolf stepped forward, touched her muzzle to the pup, and withdrew into the trees. No gratitude, no miracle made tame. Only a wild mother choosing not to strike because, for once, humans had chosen not to threaten. Near dusk, Ranger followed the mineral scent from Noah's jacket toward the old salt shed behind the workyard. Inside, beneath a frozen tarp, Clara found cloth strips carrying lure residue, scrape marks where a collar had been held against metal, and the missing half of Daniel's wind chime. Ethan took the piece in both hands. When the metal touched, it made one broken note. His face did not collapse. It only grew still in a way that hurt worse to watch. "This proves he was here," Ethan said. "It helps prove the trail," Clara answered gently. "The card, the maps, the samples, those will carry the case." As night settled, Clara's phone rang. Noah's voice shook through static. "Agent Voss, I still have the card. I can bring it. But Graham." The line cut off. Ranger rose before Clara moved, his ears pinned toward town. A gust came through the open shed door, carrying snow, exhaust, and the bitter chemical scent they now knew too well. Clara looked toward the lights of Pine Glass Ridge, small and warm beneath the darkening sky. Graham was no longer just hiding what he had done. He was preparing to make the town afraid enough to bury the truth for him. Grange Hall stood at the center of Pine Glass Ridge like an old wooden heart that had been asked to beat through too many winters. Its pine walls were dark with age, its windows glowed amber against the falling snow, and the porch steps had been salted so heavily they looked dusted with pale ash. Inside, the benches filled slowly with the people of the town. Retired mill workers in wool coats, store owners with tired eyes, field hands still smelling faintly of diesel and cold air, county officials, construction workers, and old church ladies who carried thermoses as if coffee were a form of armor. No one spoke loudly. Fear had made them polite. It sat between neighbors like a guest no one had invited, but everyone had made room for. Clara Voss stood near the rear wall with Ranger at her side. The German shepherd's sable coat had dried from the day's work, but his eyes remained bright and restless, moving from face to face, then toward the exit, then back to Clara. Ethan Rourke sat 2 rows ahead, one leg braced, shoulders squared beneath a dark jacket, his face still pale from pain, but no longer clouded. Lena Hart stood near the side aisle, tall and weathered, arms folded, watching the room with the grave patience of someone who had spent her life defending creatures that could not speak human fear back to humans. Sheriff Owen Pike stood at the front, A broad man in his early 50s with sandy gray hair, a trimmed mustache, and the heavy, careful posture of someone who had worn a badge long enough to know that law and courage did not always arrive together. Owen was not flashy. He looked like a man who measured words before he spent them. Graham Vail took the floor first. He looked almost untouched by the weather, his charcoal coat brushed clean, his dark hair combed back, his polished boots reflecting the yellow lights. He smiled with sorrow, arranged neatly on his face. "This town deserves safety," he began. "It deserves jobs, stability, and confidence that our seniors can walk their roads without wondering what may come from the trees." He spoke gently, and that gentleness did the work anger could not. People leaned in. He did not need to shout. He only needed to sound reasonable. Then he invited Helen Morris to stand. Helen rose slowly from the second row, small and narrow beneath a blue wool coat, her white hair pinned carefully behind her ears. Her hands held Benny's empty collar. The brass tag caught the light and trembled. "He was my husband's dog before he was mine," she said. "After Frank passed, Benny kept the house from feeling hollow." Her voice thinned. "Now his bowl is still by the back door. I still wake up thinking I hear his feet on the kitchen floor." The room softened around her grief. Even Clara felt it. Pain did not become false simply because Graham had learned to use it. Graham lowered his head, as if honoring Helen, but Clara saw the calculation beneath the gesture. He wanted the room to feel before it thought. He wanted the old collar to become a verdict. Clara stepped forward only after Helen sat down. She did not raise her voice. "Mrs. Morris's pain is real," she said, "but pain can be used by people who did not earn the right to carry it." A murmur moved through the benches. Clara placed evidence photographs on the council table. Ethan's jacket, the cloth strips carrying lure residue, the blocked meltwater corridor, the food waste near the construction site, the twisted trail camera, the false collar pings from W17, and Marla Finch's motel footage showing Graham's black pickup following Ethan toward the North Road. Graham's smile remained, but the warmth left it. Lena spoke next. "W17's collar data does not match our trail camera record. The collar was likely removed and placed near town to create a false pattern." She laid her report down. The wolves did not suddenly decide to haunt Pine Glass Ridge. Their route was blocked, their food cues were altered, their movements were manipulated. Raymond Cole stood from the back row. His old Marine frame looked heavy beneath his brown coat, his gray beard cut square, his white hair flattened by a winter cap clutched in one hand. He did not look at Graham at first. He looked at the floorboards, as if the truth had to climb up through them. "I saw the black pickup unloading bags near the woods," he said. "I told myself silence was peace." He lifted his eyes. "But peace cannot live on a lie." The room changed then, not dramatically. No one gasped, but shoulders shifted, eyes rose. Then Ranger's claws clicked once against the wooden floor, sharp in the silence. His head turned toward the rear door, ears high, body rigid. A draft slipped under the frame, carrying a bitter scent through the warm hall. For one breath, the yellow lights seemed to dim, and every heart in the room waited for what the dog had already understood. Noah Calder appeared near the side entrance, pale and shaking, a thin young man with sandy hair falling into his eyes and a security jacket too large on his narrow shoulders. He held a small memory card between two fingers. "I kept a copy," he said, "not because I was brave, because I was afraid he'd blame me if someone got hurt." His voice nearly broke, but he kept standing. "I opened the gate. I shut off cameras. I moved bags. I thought I was protecting my job." He looked at his hands. "I was helping him make the town afraid." Clara took the card and handed it to Sheriff Owen. On the hall's old projector screen, the footage played. Workers moving contractor bags after dark, a side gate opening, a camera tilted toward the ground, a collar device placed near a roadside bin, cloth strips being packed into a black plastic tote. The town watched itself become less innocent. Helen stared at the screen, then at Graham. Clara showed her the location where Benny's collar had been found. Near the waste area, not a wolf den, not deep forest, but beside the place where human carelessness had been dressed up as evidence. "I cannot tell you exactly what happened to Benny," Clara said softly. "But I can tell you someone created danger there, then used your grief to blame the wrong shadow." Helen closed her fingers around the empty collar. She did not forgive. She did not heal in one scene. But her gaze turned from the woods to Graham, and something in the room turned with it. Graham tried to recover. "Agent Voss is an outsider," he said. "Mr. Rourke is grieving. This dog follows commands. None of this proves—" Ranger moved before Clara did. He pulled toward the rear exit, not barking, just certain. Clara followed with Owen and Ethan behind her. Outside, snow fell over the parking lot in silver threads. Behind the hall, near the trash bins and fence line, Clara found 3 cloth packets tucked where the wind could catch them. The same bitter lure scent rose from them, sharp enough that even Owen stepped back. Graham had not needed wolves to reach the crowd. He only needed one glimpse near the parking lot, one panicked camera clip, one frightened headline by morning. Ranger followed the scent to Graham's black pickup. Owen did not rush. He took the cloth packets, the witness statements, Noah's footage, and the key ring found in Graham's leather folder. A salt shed key and a side gate access card. "Mr. Vale," Owen said, voice steady, "you are coming with me for questioning." "This is a mistake," Graham said. Owen looked older in the snow, but also clearer. "No," he replied. "The mistake was waiting this long." As Graham was led away, the wind shifted. From the tree line beyond Grange Hall came a distant wolf call, not fierce, not triumphant, but unsettled and searching. Ranger stood in the snow, eyes fixed toward the highway's red and white stream below the unfinished bridge. Clara felt the truth settle cold in her chest. The town had seen the lie, but the lie had already been released into the wind. If they did not open the right path before dawn, the wolves might still be driven toward the very disaster Graham wanted everyone to fear. Moonlight lay over North Star Passage like a pale hand trying to calm a frightened animal. The unfinished wildlife crossing rose above the highway in a curve of steel, timber, and half-frozen earth, its temporary fencing bent where winter and human carelessness had both pressed too hard. Below it, traffic moved in red and white streams, steady and merciless, a river of machines that never wondered what ancient trail it had cut in two. Clara Voss arrived first with Ranger beside her, the German shepherd stepping from the SUV with his body low and his ears forward. His sable coat caught the cold light in bronze and shadow, and his amber eyes fixed on the dark tree line where the wind was carrying Graham's bitter lure scent toward the wrong place. Sheriff Owen Pike brought 2 patrol cars and 3 county rangers, all told to keep their lights low. Ethan Rourke climbed out more slowly, one leg braced, one hand gripping the doorframe until the pain passed through him. He was still pale, still carrying the night in the forest inside his shoulders, but his eyes were clear. He did not try to be the man who lifted the heaviest thing or ran ahead of everyone. That, Clara thought, was its own kind of courage. A wounded man who knew his limits could still save lives by refusing to become another problem. Ethan studied the wind, the slope, the glare from the highway, then pointed with 2 fingers. "Put the vehicles there, angle them down, not out. Give the animals darkness behind them and a quiet line toward the trees." Lena Hart moved through the snow with a field pack over one shoulder, her silver-brown hair tucked beneath a wool cap, her green eyes narrowed against the blowing ice. She carried soft rescue poles, scent bags, and a radio clipped to her jacket. The county rangers trusted her because she spoke to them the way she spoke to injured hawks. Directly, without fear, without flattery. "Nobody pushes them," she said. "Nobody chases them. We remove the bad scent, open the right route, and let the wild remember itself. Clara repeated the order. No sirens, no shouting, no bright beams toward the tree line. Ranger stood in the open snow, not lunging, not barking, but holding the stillness around him like a lantern. The lure packets from Grange Hall had already done their damage. The scent rode the wind toward the highway, confusing the natural path of the pack, pulling hunger, stress, and memory into one dangerous thread. Clara could almost feel Graham's plan in the air, one wolf-shaped shadow near headlights, one frightened witness, one headline before sunrise. Fear did not need a complete story. It only needed a shape. Then W-17 appeared. The silver-gray wolf came down from the pines first, lean and wary, her body angled sideways to the open ground. Behind her, the pack shifted between trunks, restless and uncertain. They were not an army. They were not monsters. They were tired wild things, standing where no wild thing should have been forced to stand, caught between a blocked corridor, a false scent, and the thunder of the highway below. W-17 lifted her head, nose working the air, and for a moment Clara saw not danger, but confusion sharpened into survival. A truck horn split the night from the highway below, long and sudden. The pack jolted as one, snow spraying under their paws, and a young wolf slipped toward the icy slope. For one breath, every sound vanished except the hiss of tires beneath the bridge and Ranger's low, steady rumble in the dark. Ranger moved, but not forward in attack. He crossed just enough to become a living boundary, placing himself between the young wolf and the drop without closing the distance. His head stayed low, his body calm, his voice a soft vibration rather than a challenge. Lena stepped in from the side with a rescue pole, guiding the frightened animal away from the slope. W-17 stiffened, silver shoulders rising, eyes fixed on Ranger. Clara raised one gloved hand and held everyone still. No one forced the moment. No one tried to own it. The young wolf scrambled back toward the pack, and W-17 did not advance. "Now," Lena said quietly. The Rangers pulled the bent temporary panel aside. Owen's deputies cleared the last cloth packet from the snow and sealed it in an evidence bag. Two construction workers, called from their beds and still wearing coats over pajama shirts, loosened a jammed section of guide fence while Ethan directed them from behind the patrol car. The path opened not toward people, not toward lights, but toward the dark stand of pines above the restored meltwater route. The wolves did not obey humans. They simply found at last the door humans had stopped blocking. W-17 stood still for one final moment. Ranger watched her. She watched him. Between them passed no gratitude fit for a fairy tale, no promise, no taming. Only recognition, old as snow and older than roads. Then W-17 turned, gathered the pack with a silent shift of her body, and disappeared into the trees. One by one, the shadows followed. The forest accepted them without applause. By morning, the search warrants came through. Graham Vale's black pickup was opened under Sheriff Owen's supervision. In a locked metal box beneath the rear seat, they found Daniel Rourke's real USB drive, draft agreements tied to the transfer of roadside support land, copied collar data, and notes on how to frame North Star Passage as a public threat. The salt shed yielded more lure cloth, altered maps, and storage marks matching the missing collar device. Noah's memory card, Marla's motel footage, Raymond's statement, Lena's records, Ethan's testimony, and Clara's field samples formed the chain Graham had believed no one could finish. He was formally charged in the days that followed. Pineglass Ridge did not cheer. The town had learned too much about its own silence to celebrate loudly. 3 months later, spring arrived for real. North Star Passage was not magically complete. Honest work rarely moved that fast. But the first restored green route was open. The meltwater corridor ran clear again under young grass. The waste site had been cleaned. The guide fencing had been rebuilt under independent review. At a small overlook, Ethan hung Daniel's repaired wind chime from a cedar post. When the lake wind touched it, the sound was thin and bright, like a voice crossing a long distance without asking to be mourned forever. Helen Morris came with Benny's empty collar held in both hands. She placed it near the new sign and whispered, "Benny loved old trails. Let this one stay open." Raymond Cole stood behind her, cap held against his chest. Noah Calder helped his mother, June, carry hot coffee from street. Agnes Chappell for the workers and rangers. Marla Finch later hung a hand-painted sign at her motel, "Let the wild ones pass." One early dawn, a trail camera caught W-17 and her pack crossing the first green route above the highway. No horns, no headlights, no panicked voices. Only silver shapes moving over damp earth while the Steel River ran below them, unable, for once, to claim the path. Clara watched the footage from her SUV before leaving Pine Glass Ridge. Ranger sat beside her, his amber eyes reflecting the sunrise over Lake Superior. The case was not fully closed. Ethan still carried Daniel's absence. Helen still missed Benny. W-17 would remain wild, watched from a distance, never owned by the town's forgiveness. But one path had been opened. Sometimes mercy was not a grand speech or a perfect ending. Sometimes it was a fence moved aside, a false scent cleared from the wind, and enough humility to let the lost find their own way home. In the end, this story reminds us that not every danger begins with teeth, claws, or the wild places beyond our windows. Sometimes it begins with silence. Sometimes it begins when good people look away, when truth is delayed, when fear is allowed to speak louder than mercy. The wolves were not the real enemy. They were lost because a path had been closed, a promise had been broken, and human hands had disturbed the balance God placed in the world. Every living creature has a place in creation. The dog at our feet, the birds outside our window, the deer crossing a country road, even the wild ones we may never touch or fully understand. All of them remind us that life is sacred. To love animals does not mean pretending nature is harmless. It means respecting it, protecting it, and remembering that kindness must be guided by wisdom. We do not help wildlife by feeding it carelessly or turning it into a toy for human curiosity. We help by giving it space, keeping our communities clean, protecting its habitat, and teaching our hearts not to fear what we have not taken time to understand. Clara and Ranger's journey also teaches us something about daily life. Many of us may never stand in the snow beside a wounded Navy SEAL or face a frightened wolf under moonlight. But every day we meet smaller choices. We can speak the truth when silence would be easier. We can protect the weak when others call it inconvenient. We can admit when we were wrong. We can choose compassion over pride. And sometimes when a door seems closed, God sends help through unexpected ways, through a loyal dog, a brave stranger, a quiet witness, or a small sign we almost missed. Maybe that is what a miracle really is. Not always thunder from the sky, not always a bright light in the clouds, but a path opening at the exact moment someone is about to lose hope. A bridge where there used to be a wall, a second chance where fear once stood, a reminder that God still sees the forgotten, the wounded, the lonely, and even the wild souls wandering without a way home. So let us live with softer hearts and stronger courage. Let us be kinder to the animals around us, more careful with the land beneath our feet, and more willing to stand up when something is wrong. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who still believes compassion can change a life. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, or share the name of an animal that once brought light into your life. And if you want more stories of faith, loyalty, courage, and the mysterious ways God works through His creation, please subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, protect your family, comfort your heart, and guide every lost soul, human or animal, safely home.